next few minutes, we'll show you why HIV fails as the cause of AIDS and what the real causes could be. We will also explain to you why AIDS is not being caused by conventional sex and why the clean needle and safe sex programs will do little to stop AIDS. You'll have to pay close attention and do some thinking. Number 1, HIV, like all other viruses, is harmless after antibody immunity. HIV is a retrovirus. Retroviruses reproduce themselves through a process called reverse transcription. When a person is tested for HIV with the blood test, they are not testing for the virus, but the antibody that has been generated to stop it. When a person tests positive to HIV, they have produced their own antibody vaccine, which means they are now immune to the virus. All infectious diseases must win the race against the immune system's antibodies to kill the host. There are no known diseases that ever reemerge to cause the illness after the antibodies have done their job. Every 8th grade biology student should question why this basic fact of science has been turned upside down with HIV. The taxpayer should ask why we've spent 12 years and billions of dollars developing a vaccine against HIV when the best vaccine possible already exists when an individual tests positive. Reason number 2. HIV does not kill the T cells it infects. AIDS patients are losing T cells, and because these are the cells HIV infects, it was assumed that HIV was killing them. But only under rare laboratory conditions do retroviruses kill their host cells. In fact, Robert Gallo and other AIDS researchers use T cells to grow the virus because T cells live quite compatibly with HIV. This claim that a retrovirus was killing T cells was what sparked Peter Duesberg's suspicions based on his experience with retroviruses in cancer research.
And here Gallo comes along and says, well, HIV is causing AIDS by killing T cells. When the T cells are killed, the immune deficient, and immune deficiency produces AIDS. That didn't seem to fit with everything we ever learned about retroviruses and knew about retroviruses, namely that retroviruses do not kill cells.
Reason number 3. HIV does not infect enough T cells to cause AIDS. Even if HIV killed the T cells it infects, it does not infect enough cells to cause AIDS. Shortly after HIV is brought under control by the antibody defense, the billions of virus particles become dormant and begin to disappear. Before long, the virus can hardly be found in T cells at all, infecting only 1 cell out of every 1,000, and sometimes as few as 1 cell out of every 100,000.
There is no virus in AIDS patients, only antibodies against it. So if 1 in 1,000 cells or even 1 in 100 cells is infected by a virus, you won't get a disease from it, you won't die from it. In order to die from a depletion of T cells, you would need to have a virus that kills more than half of them.
Reason number 4. HIV has no AIDS-causing gene. HIV has no specific gene or unique genetic reason to cause AIDS. All retroviruses have only 3 major genes, GAG, INF, and POL, and only 6 minor genes. Because the genes and genetic sequences are so limited in these very simple little viruses, they need all the genes to replicate. HIV is almost identical to all other retroviruses genetically. What most people do not know is that there are as many as 50 to 100 of these retroviruses that can be found in every healthy human body. All have the same 3 genes, and all are kept under control by antibodies after infection. So there's no genetic reason to explain why HIV would cause AIDS. Number 5. There is no such thing as a slow virus. HIV is said to be a slow virus that takes 10 to 12 years after infection to cause AIDS. The only way to explain this is to give HIV magical abilities to reactivate, mutate, migrate, and hibernate. These slow virus hypotheses were devised by scientists like Gajdusek and Gallo, who used them to buy time when their disease-causing agent failed to perform. They based their slow virus hypotheses on studies of Epstein-Barr, which was supposed to cause a cancer 10 years after infection. Peter Duesberg says there's no such thing as a slow virus, only slow virologists.
There is not even a shred of light on this question, why it would take 10 years from the infection to a disease. In fact, it's impossible.
Reason number 6. HIV is not a new virus, so HIV would not suddenly cause a new epidemic. AIDS cases have increased dramatically from 0 in 1980 to 500,000 by 1996, so researchers assumed that it could only be caused by a new virus spreading quickly into the population. An old virus would have caused an AIDS epidemic years ago, possibly even centuries ago, so HIV must be a new infection to cause the recent AIDS epidemic. But here again, the HIV/AIDS proponents bypassed yet another essential question of logic. How old is HIV and where did it come from? Theories about green monkey bites and traveling gay flight attendants run in the headlines, but no one in the entire government-funded research program has bothered to verify the age of HIV. Peter Duesberg says HIV is very old, using the fundamental means of dating viruses found in Farr's law.
Farr was a British epidemiologist, William Farr, in the first part of the 19th century, who noted when a new epidemic comes into a population, like AIDS is said to be new, or the virus causing it is said to be new as well, and then it spreads exponentially in that population. Translated into current tabloid newspaper reporting, it explodes into that population, like a seasonal flu epidemic. That's what Farr's law says. But if a microbe and a disease is long established, then it's old. So when you look at HIV in America, you'll find ever since it can be detected, 1 million Americans are positive. That was first reported by the Centers for Disease Control in 1985 and has since been repeated over and over and over every year for 10 years or 11 years now, almost 12 years now. So if it's in 1 million Americans for 10 years every single year, that can't be new.
So, HIV is not a new virus, and many of the people who have antibodies to it got it perinatally or from their mothers, not from dirty needles or unsafe sex, and have lived full healthy lives for centuries without AIDS. Number 7. HIV fails Koch's postulates. The universal test used by scientists to determine if a disease is truly being caused by an infection was designed over 100 years ago by Robert Koch, who discovered the bacteria that causes TB. HIV fails this test. Koch's postulates state, first, the virus or bacteria must be found in all cases of the disease. Second, this germ must be isolated from the infected host and grown in a pure culture. Third, the germ must cause the same disease when injected into a new healthy host. And finally, the germ must be found growing again in the newly diseased host. HIV fails postulate number 1 because 10 to 20% of all AIDS patients have no HIV at all. When HIV can be found, it is only in very small amounts and usually dormant. HIV passes postulate number 2 only on a technicality. It can be isolated, but it takes huge amounts of cell tissue to find it. Then a difficult chemically induced process is needed to reactivate the virus. By contrast, large amounts of active virus can easily be found with other diseases. HIV fails postulate 3 hands down. HIV does not cause AIDS when injected into test animals like chimpanzees, and more importantly, human healthcare workers accidentally infected with HIV rarely get AIDS unless they use drugs and AZT. It's obvious that HIV fails to cause AIDS beneath the microscopic lens and on the drawing board. But it doesn't fly in the population studies either. When we use the telescopic lens to observe the population at large, HIV's failure becomes linked to real names and faces. The population studies prove beyond a doubt that HIV does not cause AIDS. Number 8. AIDS has remained in its original risk groups for over 12 years. When an infectious epidemic strikes, it begins in small clusters, then quickly spreads throughout the entire population. If a disease does not spread, it is not contagious and must be caused by something non-infectious. Figures compiled by the Centers for Disease Control confirm that AIDS is not spreading into the population at large and is locked in its original risk groups. Homosexual males, IV drug users, hemophiliacs, and blood transfusion patients make up 97% of all AIDS patients and have continued at that rate for over 10 years. From the statistics generated by this vast population study, it becomes evident AIDS is more related to behavior and specific medical risks than it is to HIV infection. Even supporters of HIV concede AIDS is not becoming the world pandemic that was predicted. Reason number 9. International comparison of AIDS differ greatly.
A germ-related disease would affect a population in the same way around the world.
For example, an outbreak of cholera in India would be similar to an outbreak in Honduras. But AIDS statistics are totally different in the U.S. and Western industrialized nations compared to Africa.
In the U.S., AIDS patients are 90% male, but in Africa, AIDS is evenly spread between the sexes.
In the U.S., AIDS resides among risk groups at the rate of 97%. Yet in Africa, AIDS has no risk groups and is found at random in the general population. Only 62% of the AIDS diseases in the U.S. are microbial, but in Africa that number is approximately 90%.
Finally, reason number 10. AIDS occurs without HIV infection, and most people with HIV never develop AIDS.
The evidence in support of the HIV hypothesis is based solely on correlation. Because the virus is often found in most AIDS patients, we have assumed HIV is causing AIDS. But the logic of that assumption is flawed because correlation does not prove causation. For example, the presence of HIV in AIDS patients is no more proof of the cause than the presence of birds on power lines prove that the birds cause power failures. They only correlate. So if HIV is a harmless passenger virus that only correlates with other real causes of AIDS, we should expect to see two things: people with AIDS who are not infected with HIV, and HIV-infected people who are healthy and do not get AIDS. And that is exactly what is happening. Finally, the most convincing argument against HIV: the millions of people worldwide who have the virus and are not becoming sick. This is very apparent in Africa, where 97% of those with HIV are healthy and do not have AIDS. Documented AIDS cases amount to only 3%.
We have a long way to go in the fight against HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, 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 the virus that causes AIDS.